everybody. Can you hear me in the back enough for the introduction? Great. I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Dr. Peggy McNeal. Okay. Peggy is visiting us from Towson University in Maryland, everyone knows where it is, from the Department of Physics, Astronomy, and Geosciences. She's an associate professor and a geoscience education researcher. So I know you have a slide that goes a little bit in your background. The short version of it, she comes from a physical oceanography background that went into geoscience and geoscience education. So she has this wonderful blend of the physical sciences and educational research. I met Peggy actually earlier in May at an education research workshop, thinking about field experiences for students, and was really excited about some of her work that she's going to talk about of going out with the class, chasing storms and learning about their spatial reasoning. So that's one component of the really interesting research that Peggy does and is going to share today. And as always, I like to share kind of a fun tidbit. Peggy is a very avid runner and cyclist, which I think could get along with a lot of people in this department. So maybe you can have some things to share afterwards. So with that, I'll turn things over to Peggy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Did you
Oh, I did not. Thank you for the reminder. Okay, how about now? Yay. All right. So thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful day. I've enjoyed talking with so many of you, and I appreciate you having me. I'm going to share with you today my adventures in atmospheric science education research, or what we call ASER. I'm going to focus on my work into the role of cognition in learning atmospheric science. So here's the plan. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. Then I'll tell you about a fairly new research area, atmospheric science education research. I will do that in part by illustrating 3 projects that I've been working on. In the first one, we looked at how students understand and interpret meteorological data displays. In the second project, we moved on to looking at how students are interacting with physical models of the atmosphere that some instructors use in their classrooms. And then in the third project, we are looking at how students interpret authentic atmospheric projects. After that, I'll have time for your questions. I'll point out that there is like a little tile at the bottom that will move along as I move through the talk. So if you are wondering where we are, you can always look there to know. All right, so first, a little bit about me. I actually have a degree in oceanography from the United States Naval Academy. I was part of one of the first classes that admitted women into the Naval Academy. And so after that, I did serve in the Navy for 8 years. Also started a family during that time. And when I got out of the Navy, then I taught middle school science for 14 years. I picked up a master's degree from Mississippi State during that time and got to go out with these folks storm chasing in the Great Plains, so that's me bottom left. I also participated in a program called Polar Trek that matched teachers up with researchers, so I went with a research team and 6 geoscience students to Svalbard, Norway, where we looked at sediment deposition in Arctic fjords. So that's me driving the Zodiac there in front of a glacier. And then when my youngest went to college, I went to Western Michigan University. I got a PhD in geoscience education. And from there, I accepted a faculty position at Towson University. Towson is part of the University System of Maryland, and it's just north of Baltimore. So I am a geoscience education researcher. That is what my PhD is in. And primarily, I focus on how students think and learn in fluid earth science disciplines. So most of that has been in atmospheric science, but I also did a project on thinking and learning in hydrogeology, and I've done some work with learning about oceanography. So as a geoscience education researcher, my research fits into a larger research field called discipline-based education research, or DBER. And there are many different science disciplines, so there are many different kinds of DBER. So for example, physics education research is PER, biology education research is BER, there's engineering education research, chemistry education research, math education research, geoscience education research, or GER, and then our new field, ASER, atmospheric science education research, falls under the umbrella of geoscience education research. So no matter what type of research a DBER researcher is pursuing, we all have the same goal, that is to test theory and produce generalizable findings focused on teaching and learning in undergrad STEM courses. So we're focusing on learning with undergrads. DBER investigations can look at so many different things, but here's a few examples. The development and nature of expertise, strategies for making STEM more inclusive, students' conceptual understanding, and that is where I work, how students solve problems in STEM, and even their attitudes, motivations, and values of students. So geoscience education research is a large umbrella, but historically it has focused on thinking and learning in geology almost exclusively, although we all know there are many different aspects to the geosciences, including atmospheric science. So let me tell you a little bit more about ASER. Like I said, it's a relatively new area of research. It got started kind of in 2008 when Donna Charlevoix published an article in the Bulletin of the Meteorological Society in which she called for a more evidence-based approach to teaching and learning in atmospheric science. So if we are going to have an evidence-based approach, then we need to do the research to produce that evidence. So in 2018, then I was part of an ad hoc committee where we advised the American Meteorological Society's Education and Human Resources Commissioner on best ways to support ASER and to advance the efforts. And then I was lead author on a paper that we published in BAMS that was really a literature review of the existing ASER research. There wasn't a whole lot at that time. There's a little bit more now. But basically in this literature review, we looked at and evaluated the evidence for the claims that were being made. And then in 2023, I was part of a team where we put on a 3-day workshop in Minnesota where we brought atmospheric scientists in who were interested in doing education researchers and also brought in experienced geoscience education researchers. We put them into project groups where there was a lot of mentoring and training, and they developed research projects as part of those groups that they continued after the workshop, and some of those projects are still ongoing today. And then finally, in January, at the annual meeting of the American Meteorological Society, we held a joint panel discussion where we celebrated ASER progress over the last 15 years and talked about how we can sustain momentum into the future. So the background and research perspective for my work in ASER is that I knew that there was a history of cognitive scientists working with geologists to better understand how individuals think and learn in geology. But I also knew that there was no parallel research being done about thinking and learning about the atmosphere. So what motivates me and my research group is to build on the robust research that's been done in other geoscience disciplines and apply it to learning in atmospheric science. So from here, we're gonna take off into the first project, which I call the disembedding project, more on what that means here in a minute. And in this one, we were looking at how students interact and understand meteorological data displays. So we had 2 research questions. The first one was, what spatial thinking skills predict success with typical meteorology tasks given to undergrads? And the second was, how do 3 meteorology students who have different spatial thinking skill abilities approach and complete a series of meteorology tasks. So I want to unpack this a little bit for you by first looking at what are spatial thinking skills? What are we talking about here? Well, these are the skills that enable us to manipulate, organize, reason about, and make sense of spatial relationships. So think about things like, can you efficiently pack a car, the trunk of a car? How well can you put together IKEA furniture? Can you mentally rotate something in your head? How well can you navigate with a map? These are all different spatial thinking skills, and we all use them every day. We know that spatial thinking predicts performance in STEM. There have been longitudinal studies where they tested spatial thinking skills in kindergartners and followed them all the way through to college and beyond, and found that the same students who were strong spatial thinkers in kindergarten were the ones who went into STEM disciplines in college, persisted in them, and ended up in the STEM workforce. There are multiple different spatial thinking skills that have been identified, and different spatial thinking skills are used in different STEM disciplines. We can measure these spatial thinking skills with psychometric tests. I'll show you one here in a minute. And perhaps most importantly, spatial thinking is malleable, which means you're not born with a certain spatial thinking ability and you're stuck with it. You can be trained to be a better spatial thinker. And this is especially important in education because if some of our STEM disciplines require a high level of spatial thinking, this can be a barrier for some students who don't have strong spatial thinking skills. So if we can just offer a little bit of targeted instruction, we can help those students get up and over those barriers. They'll persist in the discipline, have better success, and we end up with more diverse thinkers in the STEM workforce. Okay, so back to the first research question, which is what spatial thinking skills predict success with the typical meteorology tasks that we give to undergrad students. So we did this with an expert novice study where we individually interviewed 78 meteorologist and meteorology students. So we had anything from like a sophomore in a meteorology program all the way to like NWS forecasters who had been at it for 30 years. We gave them a bunch of tests so that we measured predictor and outcome variables so that then we could identify which spatial thinking skills were significant and predicted performance on the meteorology tasks. So our measures, so first of all, we just gave them a meteorology test to see what they knew about meteorology. That was the Fundamentals in Meteorology Inventory, Davenport et al. And then we gave them a suite of spatial thinking tests, 3 tests. One tested mental rotation, one tested disembedding. Again, I'm going to tell you what that is here in a minute. And then we gave them a visuospatial test of working memory. So to give you an idea what this looks like, this is an item from the test of disembedding. And what the participant is trying to do here is identify which of the 5 shapes in the upper and the top row are embedded in each of the configurations below. So the shape is different in each configuration. There's only one shape, and it will be right side up. So I'll give you a minute to see if you can see which of those shapes is embedded in each of those figures. Okay, so in Roman numeral 1 is shape A, and in Roman numeral 2 is shape D. So disembedding is a spatial skill where you're able to pull a pattern from a noisy background. In other words, able to separate the signal from the noise. Okay, so we gave them all of these tests. So we had numerical values for their performance on all of these predictor variables. And then we developed what we called a meteorology task series as the outcome variable and as a measure of meteorology performance. So this is like a typical case study that we would give to undergrad students, an exercise that focuses on a significant weather event. In this case, it was a mid-latitude cyclone So we gave them the surface map in the upper left-hand corner with all of the meteorology data encoded in it, pressure, dew point, temperature, wind speed, wind direction, cloud coverage. And then we gave them the 3 upper air maps that you see here, again encoded with meteorology data at different levels of the atmosphere. And we asked them to find the warm and cold fronts, PVA and NVA, cold and warm air advection, convergence, divergence, and then forecast the location of the low 12 hours later. We had an expert meteorologist score all of these. So now we have numerical data on their predictor variables and on their outcome variable. And when we looked at the correlations, meteorology knowledge correlated with performance on the task, good. And the only spatial thinking skill that correlated was disembedding. And so we entered those into our hierarchical regression analysis, where we entered meteorology knowledge in step 1 and disembedding in step 2. And we accounted for 34% of the variance. This makes sense because think about what are you doing whenever you pull a warm front and a cold front from a very cluttered surface map. You're pulling the signal from the noise. Okay, so if we graph this and we have meteorology knowledge on the x-axis and performance on the task on y, as one knows more about meteorology knowledge, as they know more about meteorology, they do better on the task, one would hope. But then we took our sample and we divided it into half using the scores on the test of disembedding. So here's the same graph. The students who were in the top half of the disembedding scores are on the top line in green and bottom half on the bottom line in blue. So you can see here that this is making a difference. In fact, it seems to be making more of a difference the more one knows about meteorology. But it's making about a 5 or 6 point difference on their score on the meteorology task. So moving on to research question number 2 then, we wanted to know how 3 different students who scored differently on this test of disembedding, low, medium, and high, how would they approach this meteorology task? And so, again, we used a qualitative study. It was a case study with 3 students. We had them work through the meteorology task where they completely verbalized everything that they were thinking and doing as they worked through it. We video recorded them, transcribed the videos, and coded them. And so here, in alphabetical order, our low to our high disembedder, ABC. We have our low disembedder Cole, medium Bart, and high disembedder Cole. I'm sorry, low is Abe, high is Cole. And again, this is based on their score on the test of disembedding. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to share with you the 2 extremes, Abe and Cole, the low and high disembedders, and I'm just going to share with you what it looked like on the surface map. So for Cole, he's the high disembedder. He did the task by looking at the warm and cold fronts. He looked at the wind direction, the station pressures, the changes in temperature and dew point. Before he marked the final placement of the fronts, he spent about 6 minutes working on the surface map. Compare that to Abe, the low disembedder. He really struggled with this. It took him about 10.5 minutes. Of all the data that was on the map, he only looked at wind direction. And then he had multiple references to difficulty with seeing the data and the patterns. So he said things like, there's a lot of clutter. I'm having a hard time kind of seeing that. It's kind of muddled. This is a tough map. I'm not seeing anything else that's popping out. And so here, in addition to identifying this as a significant predictor skill, we can see, as the students work through this, a difference in how they're approaching and struggling, in this case, with it. So here, across all 3 participants, Abe, Bart, and Cole, across all of the maps that we gave them, you can see that their instances of disembedding in blue increase as their skill in disembedding increases. And their alternatives to disembedding, which were largely using rules of thumb, and their expressions of difficulty decreased. So what does this mean for us? Students may struggle with seeing complex patterns in complex data displays. We have evidence of that now. We know this is an important skill. and we've seen students who are low in this skill have some difficulty. But again, research shows that spatial thinking skills are malleable. So if we can just offer a little bit of targeted instruction, maybe things like color coding, all of the different types of meteorology data so that those patterns pop out, that might help scaffold students with this task. I think one thing that's important is just promoting instructor awareness. I know that when I teach, sometimes I just project something and I'm going on and on about it, and I think everybody can see what I see. But we have evidence that that now isn't always the case, so recognizing that is important as well. Okay, so now we have some evidence about the spatial thinking skills that are important when students are interacting with data displays. Moving on to project number 2 then, which I call the Density and Rotating Tank Project. We're looking at how students are understanding physical models of the atmosphere that we use in the classrooms. So our first research question here is, what conceptions do undergrad students have about the behavior of fluids with different densities? And the second is, what are undergrad students' mental models about fluids in a rotating system? All right, so with both of those research questions, we approached it with the same research design. It was a qualitative descriptive study. We individually brought 59 students into our lab in 2 separate trials. And we did this in conjunction with density and rotating tank demonstrations. So the first research question is the work of my graduate student, Erica Heyman. She's looking at what conceptions do undergrad students have about the behavior of fluids with different densities. To do that, she is using demonstrations with density tanks. If you haven't seen these, they're rectangular tanks with 2 reservoirs that can hold fluids of different densities. There's a dividing wall in the middle that can be removed, and when you remove it, then the 2 fluids can interact with each other. These are common tools in undergrad classrooms. In meteorology, they can model weather fronts. And in oceanography classes, they can be used to model density-driven ocean currents. All right, so we did this in 2 trials. In trial number 1, with the first basically half group of students, we demonstrated using the density tanks interactions between warm and cold water, and also salty and fresh water. I want to point out here that unlike the first project where we were looking at meteorology students, here our participants were just undergrad students across STEM and non-STEM disciplines. We did that intentionally because these students serve as good proxies for students who first enter a meteorology class for the first time or a meteorology course of study. What we wanted to do was capture their mental models and their conceptions as they enter the program. So in other words, what are they coming in with? What are they bringing to the table? You will see here in a minute that we were somewhat perplexed by the results. And so we did a second trial, which was a replication study, and we got the same results. I'll tell you about that here in a minute. Our method was that we asked the students to predict how they thought the fluids would behave. We captured their predictions by asking them to make a sketch of it. We developed an emergent coding scheme. We had multiple coders code the sketches, and we used a statistic called Cohen's kappa as a measure of inter-rater reliability and a measure of the validity of our coding scheme. So again, here's the scenario. We brought them in. We told them about the different types of water, what we were going to do with the tank, and we asked them to draw how they thought the tank would look 1 minute after we removed the dividing wall, and we provided them with this template to do so. So these are the results with the warm and cold water. And our emergent coding scheme produced 3 main categories that you see here in the columns. The students either drew horizontal layers, or they drew vertical layers, or they thought that it would all mix up and there wouldn't be any layers. And what's interesting is that the students were almost equally divided between these 3 groups. 9 of them drew horizontal layers in the correct order. The other ones who drew horizontal layers, they were in the wrong order. So here what we're seeing is that only 9 out of the 32 students actually made a correct prediction. With the salty and fresh, we got similar results. Again, the same 3 categories with students divided almost equally between the 3. So about 1/3 of them drew horizontal layers, 1/3 drew vertical layers, and 1/3 thought it would all mix up. Here, only 7 students drew horizontal layers in the correct order, so only 7 made a correct prediction. So we were surprised by this, and so we thought, does this have something to do with the fact that we asked them to draw what it would look like 1 minute later? Like, did they think that maybe it would be over and done with at a minute, or did they maybe think whatever was going to happen take longer than a minute? And so in the second trial, we asked them to draw it 4 times. We gave them 4 tanks to sketch it. We said, sketch what it's going to look like immediately after we move the dividing wall, 30 seconds later, a minute later, an hour later. And when we coded those, we got the same results. So it didn't seem to be a problem with the timing. All right, so my graduate student, Erica, interviewed all of these, transcribed all of the interviews, and we coded them to look for what are the source of these conceptions, whether they're correct or incorrect, from where are the students bringing these ideas. And for warm and cold water, these are the codes that emerged. They were either bringing these ideas from experiences cooking and mixing, prior personal experiences, a lot of times that had to do with swimming, from school, prior education, just a gut feeling, or they were comparing it to something else. They were using an analogy. And here, notice that most of them are coming from school, so the students are remembering that they learned about this somewhere, even if they're not remembering it correctly. Here's a representative quote. I tried to think all the way back to taking physics in 9th grade and the different formulas. And this was a consistent theme. We found that a lot of students, when they thought back to what they learned, they were trying to think of a formula rather than trying to think just, how these fluids were going to behave. So when we coded the salty and fresh water, we got similar results, same categories, most of it coming from education, but a new category popped up, and that was social media. Here's a representative quote. I saw one on TikTok where they were talking about a barrier between salt and fresh water in the ocean. So when we dug into this, what we found was indeed there was a viral TikTok that was going around that was showing these 2 oceans that never meet or never mix. Obviously not true, but instructors beware. Students do bring ideas from social media into our classrooms. All right, on to research question number 2. Yes.
Sorry, can I just ask, how did they, were the ones who got them from the previous experience, were they mostly the ones that were right? How did the right answers map onto the numbers that you found in the previous table?
So, like which one of these were right and which ones were wrong? We looked at this. This is her thesis. I don't have that data up here, but I can tell you it was kind of a mix.
Okay.
So we had students, they were spread out.
Yeah.
They weren't all clustered in one area. Like, yeah, I remember this from school. So great question, though. Thank you. All right, second question. What are undergrad students' mental models about fluids in a rotating system? And here we did this in conjunction with demonstrations in a rotating tank. So I've talked to a few of you and know that you guys have and use a rotating tank here. If you're not familiar, it's just like the name sounds. It's a big water-filled tank, and it rotates at a consistent rate. It is a model of geophysical fluid dynamics. So it has water in it, and it rotates. The Earth is a sphere. It has fluids in the atmosphere and ocean, and it rotates. So imagine if you took the northern hemisphere, like cut the Earth in half at the equator, spread it flat, and started rotating it. That's basically what this model is. It is a pretty darn good model. It's not a perfect model, but it will model things like eddies in the Gulf Stream, cyclonic and anticyclonic rotation in the atmosphere. Instructors use it to model a whole bunch of things like thermal wind, baroclinic instability, Ekman layers, and flow over a barrier. So we did demonstrations of the two simplest demonstrations you can possibly do, and that is solid body rotation and dye stirring. And we picked these two intentionally because we wanted to see what students' mental models were of the initial conditions. Solid body rotation is an initial condition for all of the more complex demonstrations. Before you can do any of those things, you have to spin the tank up to solid body rotation by rotating it for like 15 minutes. The other demonstration we did was dye stirring. That's just kind of one little step more, where you take something and just give it a quick stir to introduce a little bit of flow in the rotating system. So our method was the same here. We asked students to predict what they thought would happen. We captured their predictions by asking them to sketch it. We developed an emergent coding scheme to code the sketches. Multiple coders coded it, computed Cohen's kappa as a test of the validity of our coding scheme and to test the iterator reliability. So here's the scenario. We brought them into our lab. We told them what we were going to do. We said we were going to drop potassium permanganate, which is a purple crystal dye, into the tank. We showed them what that looked like. We told them the tank had been rotating for 15 minutes, and we asked them to sketch what it would look like from a top view and a side view, and we gave them this template to make their sketch. Before I share with you what the students drew, I want you to think about what you would draw if you were presented with this scenario. You don't have to draw it or even verbalize it, but try to commit in your head an idea. I'm going to let you just think about it and think about what you would draw if you were presented with this. So are you going to tell me or ask a question?
Did they have any prior education, I guess, in both of these cases, or was this just kind of like the first?
So these are students across STEM, undergraduate students across STEM and STEM majors. So there would...
So no education in terms of like how fluids behave, for example?
No, that's what we're trying to see here, is without that education, what are their initial mental models?
Okay.
That's a great question, yeah.
Did they know where the dye was going to be dropped?
Yes, a lot of them asked that, and I actually did this in a smaller tank, like about this big, and I told them, I'm going to do it like this.
Okay.
And so yeah, they did know that. All right, so let me show you what the students drew. In the top view, they drew a lot of swirls. All right, so top left, we have some kind of a starburst pattern that is swirling. Bottom left, we have some blobs that are swirling. Bottom center, a ring, but it is swirling. And bottom right, we have some kind of clumps that are going around and around. Bottom line is we got lots of swirls, 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 swirls in the top view. In the side view, we had horizontal and diagonal dye trails, again, indicative of this swirling. So here's our code book. 22 out of the 32 students drew something in the top view that was swirling, and in the side view, 24 of them drew some kind of diagonal or horizontal dye trails indicative of swirling. 2 of them drew vertical dye trails, and 5 of them just thought it would all mix up and be all purple, and so they filled everything in. Problem is that when you put dye into a tank of water in solid body rotation, it does not swirl. It looks like this. It produces vertical dye columns that stand straight up. They don't disperse in the horizontal direction. They just kind of rotate with the tank. And that is because rotation stiffens fluid. It adds a rigidity to the water that inhibits dispersion in the horizontal direction. So what we found is that students don't have a mental model for this. In fact, I think that most people don't have a mental model for this. So if you thought it was going to swirl, no worries, because you're in very good company. But what we found from the students is that in the absence of having a mental model for this, What they were doing was co-opting or borrowing a mental model for things that they did have experience with, like swirling, stirring cream into coffee, and using that mental model in this situation. The problem is that if we as instructors don't go through this with students, then when they see these more complex demonstrations and they see all of these really cool swirls and eddies, they're going to assume that that is from the rotation of the tank rather than from flow in a rotating system. So in the next experiment, we added a little bit of flow with this dye stirring. So we hypothesized that students who had no sense of the rigidity imparted to water by the solid body rotation would predict that the rotation itself was going to mix up two different colors of dye better than the stirring, more than the stirring on its own, and more than compared to a tank that wasn't rotating. So here we used just plain food coloring because we needed two colors because we were talking about mixing. And basically we asked the students to predict the appearance of this in both a rotating and a non-rotating tank. Essentially, which tank do you think is going to mix up these colors better, the rotating tank or the non-rotating tank? So here are the results. 19 of the students predicted that there would be better mixing in the rotating tank. And when we asked them, why do you think it'll mix better in the rotating tank? 100% of them said, because it's rotating, because it's moving, because it's stirring around. Here is what it actually looks like. So in the non-rotating tank, it just kind of slowly disperses and in fact does mix a little bit. You can see a purplish hue in the middle. Whereas here, with the rotating tank, it produces these beautiful Taylor columns. Again, you don't see any dispersion in the horizontal direction. They swirl because there's flow in the rotating system, but they're not mixing together. In fact, these vertical dye columns, swirl columns, don't really mix up at all. They stay very distinct. Okay, at the same time, we did a survey of instructors. So we sent this to 76 atmospheric science and oceanography instructors, and we said, in the United States and in Europe, and we asked them, do you use rotating tanks? And if yes, how are you using them? We got 26 responses, and 65% of them said, yes, we're using rotating tanks. And this table is all of the different ways that they said they are using them. So we didn't get a very high frequency, but we got a very wide breadth of all of the demonstrations that they are using. Here you can see two of them are demonstrating solid body rotation, and one is demonstrating dye stirring. So what does this mean for us? Well, we know that fluid behavior is highly intuitive for students, and we think for everyone. And because we may not always be starting kind of at this initial condition and demonstrating that first, this could be problematic because students may have deep misconceptions about how fluids of different densities behave, and they may be bringing into the classroom flawed mental models of rotating fluids that we are not acknowledging. And because of that, students may not be learning from these common teaching models what instructors expect. They're very engaging, and students are like, oh, wow, that's so cool, it's great. But the question is, how much are they learning and taking away from it? So slowing down and spending time to unpack the behavior of fluids of different densities and how fluids behave in a rotating system may be a worthwhile use of instructional time. All right, so now we know a little bit how students are interacting with meteorology data. We've looked at how their conceptions and their understanding of physical models of the atmosphere. So now it's time to go outside. So the third project is what I call the storm chasing project. And this project is very much still ongoing. So what I'm going to share with you here is what we're looking at and some initial findings. But here we're looking at how students understand authentic atmospheric processes. Two research questions again. The first one is, how do students and experts think and learn about atmospheric processes in authentic field settings? It's a very broad question. The second one, how does emotion regulate content and event memory in these authentic field settings? All right, research design for both. This is a qualitative field study where we are embedding education researchers in Valparaiso University's 11-day convective field course. 2024, I went by myself. In 2025, we took a 4-person research team, myself and a cognitive scientist, and 2 graduate students, and we have funding for a 3rd round of data collection. 2024, we had 19 participants, 25, 17. We're including the instructors as participants. And Valpo has a really nice model where they have senior students who have taken the course before and maybe have just graduated, and they are working with junior students who are taking the course for the first time. So there's a lot of mentoring and training going on. This model is really nice for us because it gives us a spectrum of expertise to look at. We have collected a ton of data. We interviewed every single participant, asked them to do some sketching for us. They do forecast briefs every morning, which we video recorded. We've captured all of their nowcast discussions from their Discord channel. I wear a GoPro camera on my head so I can capture impromptu mentoring and active storm observations. We've got their demographic information and collected all their student journals. And in 2025, we added ecological momentary assessment, or EMA. This is a way to use smart devices to constantly monitor participants. Here we looked at emotions 3 times a day for 11 days. All right, so what are we looking at? What are we doing here? First, we're looking at how participants visualize the atmosphere in 3 directions, or 3 dimensions, by asking them to do things like, can you draw the cross-section of a cold front? And can you show us where the leading edge of that would be in the upper atmosphere at 850 and 700 millibars compared to where it would be on the surface? We're also looking at the spatial language that they use. So looking at how they are talking about things like updraft, troughs, patterns, aloft, central, upper level. All right, we are looking at how the participants deal with some very abstract atmospheric concepts using ideas that we're bringing in from cognitive science. So here we're looking at object and event thinking. So let me illustrate this for you. In the case of a dry line, all right, which is a pretty abstract concept. So we have a dry air mass that is moving into an area with warmer and moister air. The dry air is going to lift the moist air, and because it's less dense, and as that moist air rises, it's going to cool, condense, create precipitation, and possibly severe storms. So this is a pretty abstract idea. It's actually a moisture gradient, and that can be kind of hard for students to wrap their heads around. And so what we can do with that dry line is turn it into an object like this, the dry line that is draping over West Texas. And then it is something that we can point at and talk about the things that it's doing, the events that it's participating in. So for example, a dry line can bulge, right? That dry air mass can race out in front of itself and create some enhanced convection. Again, a really abstract concept, but by turning it into an object and talking about the events that it can participate in, this is one way that our minds deal with very abstract concepts. And if we can look at how the experts are doing this, then we can possibly back that up into our instructions and help students think about it in these ways as well. All right, we're also looking at analogies, because analogies are very powerful teaching tools, or they can be, especially, again, when you're dealing with very abstract concepts. If we can find something to analogize it to, then that helps students to take things that they don't understand and map them onto something that they do understand. So we asked them, can you give me an analogy for CAPE? CAPE being convective available potential energy. And I'm going to share with you some of the responses, kind of in order of like, these are not all that great, just some better ones. So first one, CAPE is like a swimming pool. It's like a deeper pool. It's like an ice cube in a glass of water. It sinks before rising to the top. Again, these aren't the greatest ones, but CAPE is like a tipping bucket. at a water park. So now they're mapping onto it the idea that there could potentially be like a tipping point, right? CAPE is like money in a safe. So now we're looking at potential, right? It's like a car moving downhill. I like this one because now they're comparing convective available potential energy to gravitational potential energy. And finally, CAPE is like a trampoline. So here they're comparing the available energy in CAPE to the available energy that's held, elastic energy in the tension of a trampoline. So we're looking at that. I have another graduate student, Patrick Schneider, and he came to me about a year and a half ago, and we were thinking about, all right, well, what would be a good thesis project for him? And so I gave him all the student journals that I collected on the first year, and I said, read through these and see if you see anything that you think looks interesting. And he came up with a really interesting research question. Basically, he noticed that in the year that I went by myself, there was a day in Iowa where there was a tornado outbreak. And in the student journals, there were a lot of emotions around that day that were like high stress, high intensity, even students being scared. So here's a representative quote. We were barely able to stay ahead of a quickly developing QLCS. I looked behind and saw 5 separate wall clouds. This type of intense emotion he did not see in other days that the students wrote about. So he was wondering, does this intense emotion, this stress and possibly being scared, how does that affect their memory for what happened that day, and especially their memory for any meteorology content that they learned that day? So are these teachable moments, in other words? Does the stress really help them to remember things really well? Or is all the stress just kind of washing out anything that they might have learned? And so what he did was he brought the students back in Zoom interviews in November, and he asked them a series of recall questions about that day in Iowa and compared it to a day in Colorado where we did storm chase, but it was just kind of meh. It wasn't very scary that day. So here are his pilot. Well, his research question then is, how does emotion, basically what I just said, regulate the content and event memory in these settings? Here are his results. So the red is in Iowa and the yellow is in Colorado. So as you can see here, I mean, this is very pilot-y data, but we might have something here. It does look like they have better recall for here. These are just random facts. He wasn't asking anything about meteorology, but they did seem to have better memory for random facts on the day that was highly stressful. So this time, going back, this is where we use the EMA. So now he's collecting constant data on their emotions. We more intentionally collected data about the facts of the day and things that we were doing, and the meteorology content that they would have learned about any particular storm that we were chasing. And then he will come back in next month, interview all of these participants, and see how that might align with their emotions and the data that he collected there. So, what are we working on? How can we scaffold student three-dimensional thinking? Can we identify expert habits of mind, particularly in how people think about meteorological objects and events? We can look at that, then that can help inform our pedagogy. Where are analogies helpful, and where are they limiting? Where might they break down and not be so helpful? And again, where are the teachable moments during these authentic field learning experiences, and how can we best facilitate these? All right, future work. So we did another 3-day workshop last May. This was in Colorado. This is where I met Angela. And here the ASER community is interested in knowing if we can combine education research with atmospheric field campaigns to look at what students, graduate students, undergraduate students, doctoral students, master's students, all kinds of students that go on these trips, how efficacious these experiences are within an educational context. And so we brought a bunch of atmospheric scientists in who do field campaigns. We brought in atmospheric science education researchers, and we did a lot of talking and planning about what these projects might look like I'm currently collaborating with 2 other meeting participants. We have a project that a proposal that we're about ready to put in that would have us working with SERP, hopefully next summer. So that's what we're looking at now. I don't do any of this by myself. I have a whole bunch of people that I collaborate with. I want to acknowledge and thank them. These are people that serve as co-PIs on projects, graduate students. These are people that have served on my advisory board or allowed me to come to their university and gather data from their students. So I want to, again, acknowledge and thank all of them. Perhaps you know some of these people, but they are very important to this work. I also want to thank and acknowledge the National Science Foundation that funds all this work. We have a lot of program officers that are having a hard time right now, but they are there always really, champion us, champion our work, champion science, and it's important that we remember and acknowledge them. All right, and with that, I will take your questions.
We have time for questions. Students. What?
If I understand well, the angle of educational research is to improve teaching for students. So I have 2 questions which are linked. Do you produce educational guideline, and if you do, how do you incorporate both general educational research and also uncertainty in your own research about acoustic education?
Uncertainty?
Yes.
Okay, so I feel like that's a couple of questions. So let me, first of all, I was talking with somebody this morning. In education research, there are basically 2 branches. One is the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, which we call SOTL, and that is more like developing curriculum, evidence-based curriculum, looking at instructional strategies and how we can improve classroom instruction. The other is DBER, discipline-based education research, the goal again of which is to advance theory on how students learn in these disciplines. So my work is more on the theory end, and then yes, eventually we will take all that we learn here and either pass it on or do some more projects where we actually develop curriculum based on what we've learned. The uncertainty part of it, now this is a thing that is really different from being in pure science research, and although I think all I could say, science education researchers are coming from a science background. So it's really hard to come from something where you take measurements and it's like hard data, right? To people who are just all over the place and so variable. Doing research with humans is chock full of uncertainty. And so making that transition sometimes as a researcher can be really hard. Oh, this is really squishy. How am I going to deal with this? There are robust methods that we use to try to reduce that uncertainty and potential bias. And some of those I alluded to in this. Ultimately, you can't eliminate it all, so we recognize it and we state what our limitations are. But we close the gap on that uncertainty by trying to get a representative sample, by using validated instruments, by making sure that our methods are robust and that we use them reliably. And again, by checking our own biases and by acknowledging the limitations of the research. Did that answer your question? Okay, good.
Other questions? Okay, Ethan, you're going first. Order I saw you.
I find it really inspiring how you have taken different settings and asked really interesting research questions with those different settings, like different classrooms, different groups of people. So my question is, if you had either a day or a semester with a large introductory meteorology class with 300 or 400 students in it, what would you do? Would it be something like this, or would you have other questions that you'd like to ask if you had the ability to survey all of those people?
So are you asking me what kind of research would I do with my class, or what kind of instruction would I use based on the research?
I guess whichever one you want to answer.
I think, first of all, most STEM disciplines, atmospheric science being one of them, is highly spatial. So in my class, the thing that I told you about where you could color code, I actually do that. So I pass out a whole bunch of surface maps. I was telling somebody this morning, and I put them into groups. So you guys are going to look at the temperature data, you guys are going to look at the pressure data, you guys are going to look at the wind data, blah, 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 blah. And so they only look at one piece of data, and they color code just that. So now the temperature patterns are popping out of them. The wind patterns are popping out of them. Then I reform these groups so that every group has one person from each group, so it's called a jigsaw. And then they share out, here's what we're seeing with the temperature, here's what we're seeing with the wind, and then together, that group is going to look and see, okay, with all of this together, where can we draw the warm and cold fronts? So, I guess I practice what I preach. So having identified that as an important skill, I think we can teach it a little bit in our classrooms. I also, in the oceanography class that I teach right now, like this week, we are working with the rotating tanks, and last week we started with solid body rotation, and we talked about the rigidity of the water and what that's going to do. This week, I'm going to introduce a little bit of flow so that they can see, now we are seeing the spirals, the swirls that we were expecting the first time. Why is that? And what is the difference here? And so hopefully make that impression on them that it is the flow in the rotating system. Otherwise, if it was the Earth, then, well, there are swirls in the ocean, the atmosphere, but it's not because the Earth is rotating. Well, I mean, it is in part, but you got to have some kind of current or flow or whatever. So, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Do you use the results from your classes in your research?
Do I use? No, I don't really do research on my own classes.
Okay.
I usually go out and find like a university that has a larger, like a big meteorology robust program and gather data from there, because then I can get a bigger sample size. And even then, I usually go to multiple universities. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Really good talk, Peggy. My question is, how do you account for external factors like ADHD or autism in students, and does it factor into your methodology, or your research is trying to not account those differences and then do what affects the learning in these students?
So my research isn't specifically focused on those aspects. So I definitely have every type of person there is shows up in my research. And so they are included as one of the participants in this sample. I don't specifically treat their data any differently. In fact, once we receive the data, we anonymize it completely. So I don't even know who that is. What we do is we do screen for outliers and influential cases like you would in any statistics. So whether or not those students are removed then, I highly doubt it, but I wouldn't know because I've anonymized it. So other than that, like I talked about, there are variability in humans, and we all exhibit, any group that you get is going to exhibit that variability, and that's part of human subjects research, is just, yeah.
Perfect segue. Given the variability in humans, for the projects that you could control your sample size, how did you define your sample size? I think the first one was 78.
Yes, I defined it by how much statistical power did I need in order to make claims about that sample that would be generalizable.
Gotcha. So it wasn't really taking into the account that Rudra, the different characteristics that Rudra mentioned, like some might have a learning disability or some might be from a different community. It's really just about the statistics.
In this case, yes. Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, there are people who do the type of research that you're talking about. That's just not what I'm looking at.
Gotcha.
So there is a whole literature on field learning with students with different disabilities and all of that, so, yeah.
Let's open it up to the floor for a question. John?
Yeah, very eye-opening on a lot of levels, Peggy. Thanks so much. One question I've been interested in for a long time is, and I didn't know there was such a thing as DBER. Now that I do, I can put it in those terms. Not all of those subcategories of discipline-based education research have the same combination of sort of a almost at birth curiosity, and yet, like ours does, young people who are captured by this science are captured at an early age, to a large extent, not exclusively. But many of those people don't realize till they're about 17 or 18 years old, just about the time they get in their car to drive to college, that they had better really learn their mathematics. And not all of those other physical sciences have that combination. Has anybody been researching that gap between the strong vocational desire to be a meteorologist and the incredible intellectual overhead required to actually do it?
Yes, the math piece, in other words, yeah.
Yeah, the math piece in the meteorology major.
And so in other disciplines, I would say that research is happening. I am not aware of specific research into mathematical ability and how that interfaces with learning in meteorology in the atmospheric science community, but part of that is, again, because we are so young. And so there are so many things to look at. One of the things that we do when we publish any of these papers is try to recognize that a huge barrier is the math.
Yeah.
And we recognize that, and we're not ignoring it, it's just that we're looking at this piece over
Right.
here. So yeah, I mean, I would guess that the main reason for attrition is math.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, you know, we've got a number of other things that feed into this. And so spatial thinking is one of those, and so that's what we're doing. But yeah, sooner or later, somebody's gonna look at that math piece.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe
All
it'll
right,
be me.
Yeah. Thank you.
In the interest of time, let's have one more, and then if you have other topics, you can contact Peggy. Any final question? Anybody?
Yeah.
Do you think maybe the rotating tank is particularly impactful because people don't have, as a demonstration, because people don't have this intuition coming in?
I think that we can
Because
we can build on the element of surprise. The fact that they're shocked. So when we did this, it was almost comical. Like, people would look at it, they're like, what? Like, they couldn't believe that it wasn't swirly. Perfect. That's where you as an instructor can really come in and build on that. Oh my gosh, you were really off on this. Why? What did you think? What did you expect? What can explain what you saw? I mean, that's really, when you talk about, there's a lot of research on misconceptions, and misconceptions are extremely persistent. They are so hard to break. So that, you know, I've done this a number of times, like teach about phases of the moon, and students have all these misconceptions, and I teach them, and I think I'm doing such a great job. Then I give them an assessment, they go right back to their misconception, and I'm like, how can you say that? So they're really hard to break, but the key to breaking it is producing some kind of cognitive dissonance where their prediction the results cannot be explained by their prediction. So they have to completely have a different paradigm in order to understand this. And that's what's going to help them get up and over and break that persistent misconception. So yeah, I think that's a really important piece of it, especially in an instructional sense.
Well, let's thank Dr. McNeal again.
Thank you.